My name is Kristen Frankum, and I'm going to help facilitate this webinar. We've invited Derek Daly from Legacy Outdoor Adventures and Juniper Canyon Recovery Center for Women to share with us his expertise about culture and how to use data within your organization. He and I have had lots of conversations over the last few months about this topic, and he's definitely an expert in this area. Derek is a licensed substance abuse counselor. He presents nationally at universities and conferences to raise awareness and address the root causes of addiction and trauma. In 2011, he founded the LOA Fund, a nonprofit supporting equitable access to mental health and addiction treatment. He was recognized for his philanthropic efforts in the 2017 Utah Community Service Award recipient. He currently serves on the Outdoor Behavioral Health Care Council Board, working with leading professionals to advance the field through best practices, effective treatment, and evidence-based research. As a passionate advocate of wilderness therapy, he is committed to expanding the use of nature connectedness in behavioral health care. He's a co-founder of two residential treatment programs, Legacy Outdoor Adventure and Juniper Canyon Recovery Center. These programs blend traditional psychotherapy with outdoor experiences. On the weekends, he and his wife are learning to ski with their 9-year-old son and 6-year-old daughter, negotiating the dubious hot chocolate to ski run ratio. And I can attest, Derek does love the outdoors and passes that on to his family. So Derek, go ahead and I'll turn the time over to you.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, as Kristen said, this is something we've talked a lot about over the last few months and really the last few years. And so, you know, a couple of my friends, Anita Tucker, and I see Neil Christensen's on, who's the chair of the research committee. I've considered myself a research roadie and supporting those guys for a long time. And so, I'm collaborating with Anita Tucker right now. I'm publishing data on substance abuse outcome from our legacy data now, and I'm excited about that. But really, in this presentation, we're going to talk about data-informed treatment and really focusing in on two parts. We'll get to that, but on using it with clients, but also how do you use some of this and incorporate it at the program level. So just really focusing a little bit more behind the data and the data not necessarily the data itself, but more of what we can put in place to help us achieve that. So data-informed treatment, just starting out, is actively using data in decision making. Data collection is incorporated as a part of weekly progress monitoring and utilized to inform individual treatment as well as provide feedback for program and individual effectiveness. And so I hope we focus in on that a lot, is that providing feedback both at the program level and the individual level. And you'll probably hear us talk a lot about that during the course of this. So client first, talking about client-informed treatment. So this is the conceptual basis is for routine outcome assessment, the ongoing measurement and use of outcome data to inform decisions about whether to continue or change or curtail treatment. So the idea is that you're instituting a measurement that you're going to implement at routine timeframes to collect data from the client that asks a series of questions, and then you're going to use that information to inform decision making or adjust treatment plan. And this is something that can be used both in individual client approach, but also when you take a step back, when you start collecting large amount of data at a program level, you can start noticing trends, and it can inform even programmatic applications. So on a weekly basis, what that's going to look like is, a client's going to take an outcome, and at Legacy, for example, the clinician will be notified prior to that session of any critical measures, and they'll have that information going into that assessment. And we could talk a little bit more about that later. Program data-informed treatment is once the data is collected and data culture is established, how does it impact programming? So it's taking a step back again and looking at all the data you're collecting and seeing, well, how does that inform our programming and how can we adjust? It's my belief, and I think that you see this, is as we start to gather data and collect data at our program, anything that we're tracking, at the end of that, we should be able to look back over time and say, this is how our treatment approach has been adjusted, or this is how we've shifted programmatic approaches based on what we've learned from the treatment. And I'll probably repeat some of these concepts, but if you just track that data and just use it to show, then you're really just leaning on the data to validate already held beliefs and biases. And so the idea is we're collecting the data and to inform the treatment, to inform the programming, and that's the idea. So there's a couple examples from Legacy where the truth is we started implementing weekly progress monitoring more as a logistical piece. In other words, it was easier to do weekly data tracking than try to have somebody track intake at 5 weeks and at discharge. And so that created some complications. And so with the program director and I got together and we implemented it weekly, specifically just so that it was logistically easier, right? And then from that, years later, we can see how collecting that data, now we're using in all sorts of ways that we didn't set out or intended to when we first put that in. Creating team and client investment in the data tracking process, this is something we put a big emphasis on. And so from the time that a client arrives, we sort of pull back the curtain and bring them into the data collection process and educate them on what the data is used for, why it's important, and why we want to invite them to take it seriously. And by doing this, we found that we've increased the quality of the data that we're collecting. When we initially put this in place and just was collecting the data, oftentimes we'd get clients just filling out, just checking all one single box, and we could see that it was invalid. The data we were collecting was not good. And so by creating a culture where both our guides, everyone in the building is invested and understands the importance in what we're doing, it has improved the quality of our data collection. We've incorporated outcomes into family workshop. This is not something that we originally did. Again, this is something that we looked at the data, and as we collected this, we adjusted our programming to bring it in because we saw the value. So now we can sit down at our family workshops towards the way through and with the client and with the parents say, hey, let's look at some of the outcomes and let's look at where this is going, and then pair that with the treatment planning and just the individual work we're doing with that family. If it's a case where they haven't been providing that data, we can look at that, and that's another tool to work with the family, if that makes sense. Establishing critical measures, monitoring to notify therapists in real time. I mentioned that earlier, but that's really key. And I think we have a couple places in here that we know from research that therapists are inherently bad at predicting where our clients are at, right? There's often a mismatch of where a therapist might identify that client is and where that client identifies. Ellen Behrens gave a good example, I think, at NATSAP, where she talked about working with a client in individual therapy for a year's time. And finally, in one session, she came forward and talked about suicidality. And she'd been feeling that way for months and months, but hadn't brought it into that session. And so that points to the value in having some of these measurements in place. You get that real-time feedback, particularly in our programs. I think it's important. Share outcomes during treatment meetings for treatment planning. So we have weekly sessions where we will do case management and talk about a client, and we can pull in and look at that data to inform the treatment planning and case management with the clinical team. And that increases the investment from the whole clinical team around that process. We have a dedicated research coordinator, Corrine Jensen. That's her role. One of the values, the biggest values that I've seen in that is she's building individual relationship with the clients. We're unique in that she can interact with the clients and really create some investment that way. The biggest benefit that I've seen in that is in the post data collection. We're getting our 6 months and 12 months post. because there's this personal relationship with that person who's asking for that, we've been able to really increase our response rate. Owners and managers are invested and engaged, including in supervision, monitoring, and adjusting data tracking practices. How we've sort of operationalized that here is we will have a quarterly or meetings with our entire staff, including our field guides, where we can report and share on what does the day look like, and both use that for feedback, to invite feedback from the program and from our employees, but also to celebrate our successes of the data tracking and what it's looking like.
Thanks, Derek. I do have a question for you. How long has Legacy been doing data collection, and why did you begin? And as you're talking about that, we can kind of talk about why programs are implementing data into their program.
Yeah, that's a great question. Well, I think the truth for me and Legacy, there's two parts to that question. One part is, Gil Hallows and I have recognized and seen the value in being a part of the OBH Council and the emphasis the OBH Council put on research. We knew that to be within integrity, we were asking others and other programs to join the efforts of collecting industry data. And so a motivator for us was to be who we say we are. And if we're going to be advocating to do this at an industry level, then we need to make sure that we're doing our part. And so that's where it started. So we started from the very beginning of Legacy with paper outcome questionnaires, and we do those at intake at week 5 and a discharge. Quickly thereafter, we went to weekly. And also I would add to, and we're going to get to some of this, there's a bigger culture of data collection where we're also instituting measurements and ways to collect program data. And we're going to talk about some of that. Outside of collecting client data and program data, we're collecting data on our entire program. And we'll get to some of that. Was there 2 parts to that question?
Have you been doing it? So how many years have you been gathering data for Legacy?
8, 9, I think we're coming up on 9 years, I believe. Well, our really good data, though, has come in the last 5 years. I think we got off to a rocky start with some. So we're going to talk about why programs are implementing data, not just within OBH, but now at NatSap and some of the other things. And so I think we mandated. There's the list. We'll go through it. We'll start with mandated. Joint Commission standard now requires any behavioral health organization to assess outcomes for individuals they serve through the use of standardized tools or instruments. And so we're seeing a lot of programs, NatSap and otherwise, who, if they're interested in pursuing Joint Commission, then implementing the measures, for example, in the way that the OBH Council or now NatSap is, it meets that standard. And then an additional point is, as of January 1st, our conduct assessment through the use of a standardized tool or measurements. And so it's just sort of restating that it's now a requirement for all existing Joint Commission, and anybody who's applying in the future will have to have this. So it's mandated is a pretty strong motivator for many programs. It was nice for us when we went through the Joint Commission process. That was something that we had solidly already in place. Fear of missing out or being left behind. I've definitely seen this as a motivator, and it goes back to, I think, being a part of the OBH Council, and part of the motivator for us is like, hey, we want to be a part of this. We recognize that there's something good in here, and we don't want to sit around and watch other people drive this process for us forward and be left out. We want to be at the forefront, believe that there's value in that, and that being left out of that is a disadvantage or will become a disadvantage. So you're seeing now at the OBH and National Association of Therapeutic Schools and the National Association of Addiction Treatment Providers all moving towards making this a part of an expectation. And so, it's nice to be on the front end of that as a program, because it's moving in a direction where you're going to have to implement some of the data collection practices. Marketing. And so, this is something that, as I've sat around the OBH, I'm the marketing chair for the OBH Council. Um, really believing in data collection and gathering that, but to what end? I mean, part of the end is to educate ourselves and inform our treatment, inform our programming so that we can collectively get better, but then also sharing in that collective success, celebrating the work that we've done, and educating the public. And so I think that, you know, as an industry within OBH, for example, I think we've done a great job of really getting on track with the data collection. And I think that we're in a place now where we can start moving forward with more education. When we went to DC last year, we were able to go in and take a lot of this stuff and educate on the research that we're doing and really back that up with some really nice studies. This is an example of how legacy, we put together this little video. I invited Mike Petrie from Petrie Consulting over and to just go through legacy's data. And we use this most often when we get an inquiry from a family. We'll send this as part of an email just educating on legacy. And they can, if they're interested, they can click. And this is a little easier way to get an introduction to the research than just looking at the graphs and trying to interpret it. And so this is just a little piece. Maybe we'll watch just a little section of that.
Legacy Outdoor Adventures uses the OQ 45.2, which is a well-respected mental health measure. It's normed, it's valid, it's used internationally, and they use it at admit and discharge to collect outcomes data. So when collecting outcomes, you have to establish a baseline, you have to measure at the end of treatment, and then you need to measure post-discharge to find out whether or not anybody got better. They also facilitate client progress monitoring, which is regular mid-treatment sampling of clients to track their progress. And it's really the gold standard in treatment these days, because to use a normed and valid measure on a regular basis and to share the results in session with the client is proven to impact outcomes in the sense that you get more robust gains in a shorter period of time. It's actually, the OQ45 used in that way is on the NREPS registry of evidence-based interventions. So it's not just for research, it actually impacts the quality of treatment.
So that example, if you guys are interested in checking out that full video, you can find it on our website or on the YouTube channel. You know, it's not a flashy video or fancy, but I think for a lot of our families, the feedback that I've got, they appreciate just walking to. Another motivator for programs of why they're implementing this is to improve outcomes, and I think that this is core, right? I think, you know, I would say back a little bit and say from OBH and from a program OBH perspective and a wilderness therapy perspective. We've been doing this work for some of us 20 years plus. And so there was a real motivator in validating the program that we knew and we were passionate that worked, but we didn't have anything that we could come and say, hey, look, it does work, and then compare it to, for example, treatment as usual. Now, with the latest research, if you see Mike Gash, we can look at our outcomes at an industry level and say, how does it stack up against treatment as usual? And so it's taken us a lot of years to get here as an industry, but it's powerful to be able to look at our outcomes and then compare them outside of our own organizations and our own industry. This is an example of legacy. So for people who are not familiar with this is the OQ45. We use the OQ45, which is for adults. For adolescents, it's a YOQ. And that first measurement is at intake. And the higher the scale, the more clinical distress. And so you can see that clinical cutoff line. And this is not a big graph that you can see, but just real quick is anything above that clinical cutoff is in high clinical distress. And so if a client came into a therapy session or a school counselor, for example, and took that measurement and is above that clinical cutoff, it's likely visible distress or dysfunction going on in their life to where family members and others are going to say, hey, an intervention is probably needed here. You'll see by week 3, we're getting close to that clinical cutoff, because as it turns out, when you get these clients in dysfunction into a healthy environment with healthy activities and a healthy peer group, oftentimes we see them move to a healthy performance level pretty quickly. And then over the course of the program, this is all of our outcome data. They drop well below clinical cutoff at discharge, and then maintain that at 6 months and 12 months later. So I'm really excited about, and as an industry, we're really excited about looking at that 6 and 12 months in particular, where they're staying well below clinical cutoff. And in our particular case, when we're talking about adult substance abuse, oftentimes you hear the term, the revolving door of treatment. Outcomes for adult substance abuse across the country are inherently they're pretty bad outcomes often. And so being able to go to places like DC with Mike Gass and other researchers and present, say, hey, look, here's some outcomes that we're seeing. And remember, when we're celebrating this data, 100% that we are aware that this is a process. We're talking about from consultant to graduation at legacy to post-treatment follow-up. That's what's leading to these good results. This is not just a legacy success story. This is, hey, recipe that we're putting together collectively with the professionals throughout that start before legacy and go on after. It is working. And I think that that's something that we can be. And now with the golden thread, which we're not going to talk about in this one, we can now track clients throughout the entire process, which is great, even starting at the consultant level now, which I think is really exciting. Why programs are, I mean, when we look at the healthcare world, they're already measuring outcomes and using them in treatment. And so oftentimes you see behavioral healthcare sort of following suit a little while, sometime after. And I think that you're seeing that now. And so inevitable, we're going to move in this direction. And also looking at the insurance, there are some trends moving towards value-based care, which is really exciting to me, because if I can go to an insurance company as a wilderness therapy program and say, hey, look at our outcomes. Let's pay for value-based care and focus on the outcomes and forget about the pay for service and breaking up these bills in all of these ways. And they just look at pre and post and what that looks like. I think that's an exciting place. And I'm hoping that we move to that place within healthcare sooner rather than later. And then mandates from again, we already talked about that, but mandates from accreditation bodies and payers are requiring programs to move in this direction, just highlighting that insurance companies are likely going to be moving in this direction. This is just a continuation of that. I think it's worth highlighting. This came out in the NatSat press in February, but it says, make no mistake about it, sooner or later we will be legislated into requiring accreditation. In fact, with the Family First Act, all programs taking public dollars are now required to be nationally accredited. Why not act now and get the credit for raising our hands and volunteering to have someone hold us to a higher standard? I take a lot of pride in the OBH Council and my role in the OBH Council and the OBH being leaders on this front. I think we had our own, again, motivations for that, but we can say we raised our hand and we sought to hold ourselves accountable to raise the bar, and we're way out in front of this, and I think that it's going to serve us in the long run.
We want to address and know that there might be some anxiety around outcomes measurement and implementing that into your program, and address those while we're in this section.
Yeah. I mean, I think some of these roadblocks are changing as I think momentum gains. But when I look back on the past 5 years of the uphill battle to get to this place, these are some of the roadblocks that I've noticed and identified. Let's start with too expensive. So I've heard many programs talk about it being too expensive, and this is sort of looking at some of the cost, OutcomeTools costs, data collection software, full-time employee, and you can see the breakdown there. There's a scale. I can say that at Legacy, when we started off, we had one group of 8 clients, and we were doing paper. At that time, I was program director. We were doing paper management, and it didn't cost a lot to get started. Within a bigger organization, to do it well, it does cost. But now with the different options available out there to make this easier. I think it's more cost effective. And again, I think when you weigh the cost versus the improved programming and client care, I think that it's really a no-brainer. And more so for me, that's clear today than it was 8 years ago when we started. Again, when I started, it was a motivator to support the OBH Council and the industry data. Now, I'm so much more clear on, we're looking to incorporate data outside of even what's required with the OBH Council because of the value that we see in improved care for our clients and in programming. I love this slide. This is something we've shared a little bit, and I'll connect with this, but this was a quote that we found researching for another presentation, Mike Petrie and I. He uses statistics as a drunken man uses lampposts for support rather than illumination. And I think that this is an okay place to start. Again, I think about the OBH Council and our work. We started from a place of, we want to validate what we already know is true. You know, we believed into it. We wanted to use the data to confirm our already held beliefs and biases, right? But if we just lean on the data for support and not to illuminate what we don't know, then I think we're really missing the ultimate purpose or value in data collection. And this was a process of, again, for learning for me. And as an industry, you know, after years of data collection, as programs at a client level, at a program level, and at an industry level, when we look back on the years of collecting data, we should also be able to point to, this is how we've changed. This is how we've adjusted treatment. This is how we've adjusted programming, because we've learned through this process. If we can't do that, then we're probably missing something in that process. To address the specific thing around fear, I think that I have had conversations where people are fearful of what they're going to discover. I want to speak to my own personal experience on that just real quick. When I've had conversations with consultants or referral sources where I've said, look, Legacy, we've been tracking data, and here's what we learned. Here's what we learned we were not doing well, and here's how we've adjusted based on the research. It actually strengthens trust and builds relationship when you can engage in that conversation. So yeah, I think that having some fear around what you might find out is valid, but by going through that process, then you can make adjustments. If you don't know or are not aware, it's hard to really address those things. The next one is measuring is not needed, just a sort of general attitude. I think it goes with ego, which we're also going to talk about, that I know what we're doing well. This is not important. I'm just going to focus on the client. And I really like this piece right here. This is talking about feedback-informed treatment again, and just highlighting that doing this on an ongoing basis, it's 2.5 times more likely, clients are 2.5 times more likely to experience benefit from treatment. So we're going to do a poll here, and I'm hoping we'll get some population, but which of the following reasons likely create this benefit from feedback-informed treatment? And I can tell you that when I first did this, I guessed wrong. Okay, so that makes me happy because 49% of the people who selected 50 feedback helps clinicians select the most effective treatment was my initial thought and guess. But it turns out the correct answer is feedback-informed treatment enhances the therapeutic relationship. And so that sort of caught me. It's like we're gonna administer an assessment to ask you where you're at, and that process enhances the therapeutic relationship. And I had to think about that and why that is. And here's what I've come to understand is when we're, as a clinician, working with a client, if we sort of pull back the curtain and say, hey, look, take this assessment, and we educate them on the value and why, and again, they can appreciate that. It builds trust, because part of what we're saying is we don't know. We're inviting honest assessment. It builds trust in that relationship with the client, rather than coming from the approach that is tempting of we've got the answers already. And so that, from reading and really trying to understand, that's the best that I can understand, that feedback-informed treatment enhances the therapeutic relationship. I think that that's really exciting because I'm a firm believer, and the research does support that relationship and trust in that therapeutic relationship is the number one indicator of effective outcomes. So if you're interested in improving your clinical work, use feedback and treatment, and it'll enhance the relationship. And 49% people got that right too, which is great. I had to throw a Mike Tyson quote in here. If you are not humble, the world will visit humility upon you. So ego, I think it's easy as business leaders to become resistant to feedback as we often overestimate our abilities. I put business leaders, but I would also add clinicians to that. To effectively counterbalance our own ego, both as business owners and as clinician, establishing routine feedback and assessment at every level is the best approach. And so, again, we're talking about implementing these both at the client level and the program level. When I first came into this, it was a really hard thing for me. Interestingly enough, when I would hear feedback, I personally tend to focus on the constructive feedback and ignore the positive feedback, and I would just highlight that it's both. You know, we want to have some open lines of communication with our clients, with our program people, to both so that we know where there's areas of improvement that we can focus on and things that are going well. And without that, then we're really missing out. And so I think ego is definitely a roadblock. This is a big one. Particularly, I think, with clinicians. If you're dealing with insurance, this is even more of an issue. But on average, clinicians spend 30% of their day doing paperwork. We are pre-authorizing and billing insurance as a licensed TC now, OBH, and I can tell you that it is an added burden. And so we do have reduced client caseloads because of that, because it does take extra work. But the research does show high documentation to clinical service ratio leads to a high rate of burnout, job dissatisfaction among clinical staff, fewer scheduled treatment appointments, no-shows, cancellations. This is sort of drawing from your treatment as usual approach, your regular therapy practices. One of the things that I just want to share is we're now in a place and moving more into a place where these things can be systematized at the program level and in the clinical work to remove that burden and lessen the degree of just burden of paperwork. And so we've really looked for ways to do that at Legacy so that it's not just a trail of paperwork, whether we're collecting it at the program level or with the client. So again, our clients come in weekly and we're actually doing it on iPads, and they can go in and automatically uploads, and it's really efficient that way. And so it reduces the burden of time and too much work, because it is definitely a factor. Establishing a culture of data collection. I could not find a quote that worked, and so we decided that we just put this quote in here that I made up, and I actually put this at the top of we have a feedback, assessment, and supervision form that we've instituted at Legacy going back 7 years ago, where it constantly evolves the questions that we're asking. And on top of that is this: the first step in improving anything, especially ourselves, is knowing where we're currently at. And so that assessment piece of knowing where your culture's at, knowing where your clients are at, is the start place if we want improvement of anything. Put this picture of the circus plate spinner. I think from a program level, oftentimes, you know, having you spin this plate of data collection, and it's going, and you're getting all this great data, and you sort of check it off the list, and then 3 months goes by, and you have to come back to it because the culture is slipping, or it's not where it was. And I think that that's like so many of the things within our program. It's important to have those plate spinners, people who are champions of the various things that are inherent a part of your culture, so that you can maintain those values, right? And so I certainly feel that, where we're having to constantly spin those plates. But defining the culture, we're going to talk about that in this section. The magic combo, assessment versus supervision, which I'm really excited about. It's been very effective for us. And then key factors of establishing a culture within the program. Defining culture, the way of thinking, behaving, and working. And just want to make a distinction, because we're going to talk about that in this section, a distinction between culture and work climate. So culture is shared values and beliefs that govern how people behave and provide boundaries that help people perform. And so at Legacy, when we, for example, have a new hire, someone comes in, one of the things that we always say is we invite them to come in, get a good look at us and see if we are who we say we are, and vice versa. And then we're going to see if that matches up culturally, right? If our cultures and our values and all that match up, then we know it's going to be a good fit. Work climate is shared perceptions, attitudes about the organization. So that's more feeling. So culture is, how does your organization behave? How does it operate? How does it function? And climate is, how do people feel about those functions? And so oftentimes when people talk about improving culture, oftentimes it's easier to focus on feelings. And so we'll look at ways to incentivize or to just focus on structural issues underlining that, then it's going to be an uphill battle. And focusing on work climate solely is not going to lead to cultural changes in most instances. And so the culture really does come from the core values of the organization, and really putting a focus on having those operationalized within the organization. So the magic combo, the first, we talk a lot at the program level, so less at the client level, although it's still applicable. But the first step, again, is assessment. Evaluation or estimation of the quality performance of someone or something. The second approach that people take is supervision. So action or directing or providing oversight over someone or something. The magic combo that seems to work really well is pairing engaged supervision and assessment monitoring through the use of various measurements. So pairing supervision with assessment. And then there's the last one, which is professional or outside consultants provide strategy. So as a program, you can hire people who are experienced in these practices of implementing this, and they'll come in and help do a full assessment. And people who are really good at this are going to focus on culture, and they're going to look at climate and take all that into account as they're implementing these practices. So this is an example, and it's important with this slide. We're measuring climate. So how do people feel about the organization? There's also some measure of how effective we are at addressing the specific thing. And so I'll use an example. This is not a legacy example, but I think it's an easy understand. Is if the lights are not getting turned off in the building, and you just use supervision to address that issue, right, within the program, then what you'll see is, that's the blue line. It might be hard for some to see. The blue line is, you're going to see a slight uptick. In other words, the initial response from people is going to be, hey, I appreciate this. You're checking in on me. You're paying attention to me, and I'm going to turn off the lights. But over time, when someone comes in and says, did you turn off the lights today? Did you turn off? And it's just supervision, then you actually end up with a negative result on how people feel about the climate. And in our culture in the United States broadly, a lot of organizations tend to overuse supervision as a means to fixing problems. So they identify a problem, and then they say, okay, you're in charge of fixing it, and I want you to watch them and make sure they do it. That inherently leads to low work climate, right? Negative feelings about the work environment. If you just use assessment, you see gains on that, and then you see some slight gains on on climate too. So if you just ask people, just assessment, how did this go? We're checking on this, and you invite some honest feedback on that, then you will see some gains. If you pair those two things together, that's where you get the greatest results. So for example, we with the field supervision assessment form, we're at our program, we limit it to 10 questions, and we're going to assess on those 10 questions, and we're going to sit in a room, and we're going to come up collectively with those questions. In other words, we're going to ask our staff, our clinicians, anyone in the building, what is it that we need to focus on? What do we need to track? What do we need to look on? What do we need to improve? Oftentimes, I go into those meetings with an idea or an agenda of my own, and inevitably, it comes up naturally or organically through the employees and through our culture. We identify those things together. Then we're going to check on it weekly. We're going to meet with supervisors and just review the assessment. And really, it's a process of understanding and trying to identify ways to get better. So, looking at a program example, you can look at this from a clinical perspective, but I think it's really easy to illustrate with more programmatic examples. We were not getting pictures from the field, from our guide, to show clients' faces on pictures on the family bridge. So we put that on the assessment and supervision form, asked clients, did we get pictures? And what we saw is over time, we started to get pictures just by asking the question and then having this weekly or pair up this conversation with the supervisors. Then once we got to that place, the quality of the pictures were not so great. And so the question changed in version 2 and so on. And through that process, we learned that we didn't have great cameras. The battery life was not good. And so when you look at that travel through time, through a 1.5 to 2 year process, I've got books where we can go back and we can literally see the culture development around all these programmatic pieces as well as clinical pieces. Key factors of establishing culture: data collection, create investment by connecting data collection to the core ideology. For legacy, our core ideology, self-awareness, honorable personhood, recovery, all revolving around a heart at peace, is operationalized, and we connect everything back to that core ideology. Implementing systems that allow for the assessment and supervision model. And so, when you have a tendency to say, hey, here's a problem, and now we're just going to supervise it to solve it, backing up a little bit, inviting a little bit more of involvement, a little bit more feedback and assessment from your team is going to be more effective. Ensure ethics are defined, understood, and practiced. And so defining what are the values and why are we doing this? What's behind? Pulling back the curve again and inviting people into that process is going to increase engagement. And then this is really important: defining roles, responsibilities, and accountability. So anytime, whether you're talking about a client, here's what we expect you to do. Here's how we expect you to perform. Here are the responsibilities that you have within the week with your role. At Legacy, we have, for example, each week our clients are given an identified role: expedition leader, navigator, cook, and then there's a set of responsibilities. And by doing that, we set them up for success. Similarly, we do that with our guide. If we don't do that, what we find in the groups and the client level is people waste time negotiating those roles and working that out. There's a great Harvard study on how people without clearly defined roles will position themselves to define that. Encourage and provoke feedback channels. And so we have it twice a week within the field, and then once a week at a program level, where we are asking the question and inviting and importantly creating the space for safe and honest feedback that's going in 2 directions.
So it sounds like when you're creating a assessment, the magic combo culture, that your continuous improvement happens and that it's very collaborative with your team. And so those are 2 really good things to develop within your culture.
Yeah, and just building upon that, looking at the approach. There's two approaches, and I think if manage and facilitate. And so I've made the mistake when I was first, program director, of wanting to manage. In other words, I had the answer, I had identified the problem, and I already had the solution in mind. And so I would have a tendency to want to go into this meeting or at the program and manage the problem. So, if you look at this on one side, you got manage, it tends to be commanding, controlling, run by the change, which is like the identified problem's going to control the behavior, adapting, aiming for destination, security, imposing solutions, provides answer. And so it's really self-protective. I've got the idea in mind, and we're just going to, there's a lot of mandate and control, and we're just going to do it. And I think it's okay, with some problems, particularly if we're talking about safety, emotional safety, or physical safety, it's okay to take a more management style approach. Like, there's not a lot of room for negotiation here, and we're gonna be really firm. And I think that's where it would be appropriate. But on an ongoing basis, the facilitate approach is empowering, run the change, anticipating, appreciate the voyage, flexibility, co-creating solutions, solicits feedback. And so when we have our weekly meeting and I'm already coming in there and I have some ideas and I'm looking at the feedback of the data that we're tracking at a program level, for example, one of the things that will happen is sometimes we will identify something that we want to track. We'll track it for 3 months, come back into there and look at the results. And we'll be able to see, like, how are we doing? We're sort of rating ourselves. So now we're presenting that information back to the team. And sometimes we'll see that, like, hey, we started off at a 3, and over the course of 3 months, we have not improved. It stayed right at 3. So then we get to collectively ask ourselves in that room with the team, is this something that is of value to us? Is it important to our program? Is it something that we want to increase our energy collectively in improving? Or are we content with this being a 3? And in some cases, we've been able to go through that process and say, we're okay with a 3. This is that's where we're at, and that's okay. We're going to put more emphasis on these other things. An overview with research, just looking back to, we start off as get on board or get left behind. I really think we're at that point to where everything's moving in this direction. And if you haven't already adopted measurements and outcomes in your program, now's the time to get started. If you have questions around that, I'm not going to have all the answers, but I can definitely connect you with people who will. You may be hesitant, but you can do it. I did not start off in any way, shape, or form with any background in research or data collection, and it was scary and intimidating, but diving into it, it's been very rewarding. Data culture enhances client outcomes. And so if you have a program and you can incorporate some of these things, it is going to improve the overall outcomes for your clients, both at a program level and the feedback informed treatment level with your clients. Data collection is not just about improving client outcomes. It is also important for improving programs. Yeah, I just mentioned. So that, I think that's a big one for me, is just, when we talk about data collection culture, it has to go beyond the client and has to come into the organization to where we're asking, how are we changing? How are we shifting the program based on what we're learning and the feedback that we're receiving? And it involves the entire organization. And so I think, again, the term that I use a lot is just pulling back the curtain, whether it's in the clinical work, one-on-one level, or at the program level. Pulling it back and saying, hey, look, here's what's going on. Let's take a look together. Yeah, I hope this was valuable. I'm interested in feedback from anybody. I think we can do some refining here, and I think that our hope is to be able to take this to some of the conferences if we can ever get back on the road. here. And yeah, thanks, Kristen.
Yeah, thank you so much, Derek, for sharing all of your experience with this. We do have a few questions, and we have just a few minutes to go through some of them. If we don't address your question, I'll email you or get you connected with Derek. But Neil is asking, how does routine outcome measurement change the way individual therapy sessions are conducted? Do you have an example to share?
The biggest example is like going back to the Ellen Barron's example. If I'm doing weekly work with a client and I have no idea that there's self-harm thinking going on or suicidality, I'm not going to be able to address that. And so by getting, that critical data in real time, our clients, our clinicians can then go in with a game plan and awareness to address and to get that. And when we invite that in with the client and they know, then it can be a real relationship builder. So I think that's one example. Another example that I've seen is seeing, if pre-family workshop, or when we start to talk about aftercare programming and we see it, in the OQ and increases in anxiety or these things, we can bring that in and talk about saying, hey, what's going on this week? It seems to be different than last week. Let's talk about some of the things that are going on right now and address that. Those are a couple of examples that come to mind.
So Neil, I have an example as well. We did a webinar earlier in the year last year by Ellen Barron's, and she actually presented it at the last NATSAP conference about progress monitoring. And she and Mike Petrie did a kind of an example of what a progress monitoring routine outcome measurement example would be using the YOQ and talking about it in a client session. And we have a copy of that on our website if you wanted to go. It's about 15 minutes long within that presentation of a mock session that they do that with. And so it can give you an example of how that conversation looks like with your client in a real-time session.
That was great. That was great. I was there for that, and I think that was really, really great. And I also have no doubt that Neil probably has some great examples of his own.
All right. Francis is asking, is Legacy using Best Notes, and how are you using it? Yeah,
we use Best Notes. How are we using Best Notes? CRM. We use it from application. From the moment that we get the application, it goes into Best Notes. It goes into the student file. They're split into groups under clinicians, and so that's where we're tracking and keeping all of our client information and data, and so as well as our professional contacts and data. So we're using it to track and keep track of all of our treatment planning, our data notes, anything. So if anything comes up and there's a question around a particular client, we can go into Best Notes, and all that information is going to be there.
Perfect. Neil is also asking, what data collection software are you referring to? I think it's the Petrie Consulting software, and so maybe you can speak to that a little bit, Derek.
Yeah, I mean, we use R2D2. I get on and look at that, which is really nice. And so we even collaborated with Petrie, and so Petrie has Petrie Consulting has his own software, R2D2, that sort of mines all of our data and presents it in an easy to view format where we can look at these graphs. We can also we also collaborated with Petrie, I might add, to add some additional questions. When we've got this substance abuse data, for example, that we're getting ready to present on with Anita, we realized we've got these great OQ outcomes. So at intake to discharge, we see these great gains, and they're maintained 6 months to a year, but we have no idea, are our clients sober? Did they have a relapse? Are they in program? There's a lot of questions that we didn't have. So we collaborated with Mike, added some of those questions, and then went live with them. And so when we were following up with our clients' posts, we were able to ask additional questions. And so that's a real value. It's the remote patient monitoring. I believe so for anyone who's interested in an easy and affordable way, I would give Mike a shout out for implementing without hiring a person to manage your outcomes, it's a pretty affordable way to go about doing that.
Thank you all for attending. If you, Derek, do you have any last minute words that you want to share?
Yeah, feel free to reach out. You know, I would just say that we're still learning and still changing. I'm excited about collaborating on research right now. We're going to publish. I'm excited about where we are as an industry with OBH. And yeah, thank you. And I hope that we can take this on the road and continue to improve at a program level and at industry level. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Derek. And if you're not currently using OutcomeTools and you're wanting to get started, feel free to reach out to me. And thank you all for attending. And we hope that you were able to take something away from this to take back to your organizations. And we will be sending out a copy of the slides as well as a recording of this webinar for you, so you can share it with whoever, if your organization might benefit from this. Thank you and have a wonderful day.